Dmitry Ivanovsky was a Russian botanist who in 1887 was asked to investigate a problem. Tobacco plantations in the Ukraine and Crimea had huge swaths of plants that were dying off from some mysterious disease. Dmitry discovered that an extremely small agent, invisible to the naked eye, and something no one had a name for, was spreading and replicating itself from one plant to the next. Several years later, a Dutch microbiologist named Martinus Bierzenik followed up on Dmitry's discovery and gave this mysterious tiny infectious thing a name. He called it a virus. Now, people had known for years that disease could be spread from one living thing to the next. By the time Dmitry came along, they already knew all about bacteria. But the discovery of the virus caused a paradigm shift in science, a whole new way of understanding how disease spreads. And if you know how it spreads, then you can figure out how to keep it from spreading and eventually develop therapies and vaccines to stop it in its tracks. So when you take your first shot of the COVID vaccine, it might be nice to say a little prayer of thanks for Dmitry and Martinez. Because the paradigm shift they gave birth to could literally be saving your life, and it will save the lives of millions of people. A paradigm shift is a basic change in our underlying assumptions and how things are perceived, the lens through which we view the world, but it also how we respond. Now, we can imagine paradigm shifts as being these sudden aha moments, like a scientist in a lab discovering a virus. But the truth is, a paradigm shift is usually more gradual, and it can happen personally, it can happen culturally and socially, and it can happen spiritually. It's important to be aware of that because it can help explain why things happen the way they do. Last month, when a mob invaded the U.S. Capitol, it was shocking. If you're like me, beyond being just plain all upset that they were trying to disrupt democracy and actually bring harm to their political enemies, and that their actions resulted in people dying, you had to wonder, who are these people? And why in the world are they motivated to act that way? Why do they believe what they believe? The lens through which they view the world, their paradigm, is something most of us, obviously, and thankfully, don't share. But we need to understand it just the same. The fact is, a lot of our fellow citizens do have an understanding of the way the world works. It's very different. And that paradigm is something that actually has a long history, and not just in the United States. It's based on the assumption that there's a natural hierarchy to humanity and that your exalted place in that pecking order is threatened. It's the assumption that your race and religion and cultural norms are inherently superior to other races and religions and cultures who are then cast in the role of enemies who are conspiring against you. It's the assumption that life is a zero-sum game with winners and losers and that only the strong survive. It's tribalistic and territorial, and it views reality in stark black and white terms, and it takes on the posture of perpetual victimhood and grievance. Conformity and obedience are valued more than expressions of other points of view. So you feel your very identity is endangered, and so you fight back. It's really a paradigm of power. That worldview, that paradigm among people, appears to be on the rise, and that's troubling. As the world changes rapidly, as we become more interconnected globally, as societies become more diverse, as we cooperate more to solve problems like climate change and poverty and health and racial and economic inequality, all those efforts that bring people together for the common good can also be seen as evidence that the world as you need it to be to sustain your place in it is being stolen away from you. Now, adopting that worldview doesn't happen all at once. Big economic forces seemingly beyond your control can threaten your livelihood. People who don't look like you or worship like you move into the neighborhood. You discover people online who traffic in ideas that increasingly play on your fears. Folks who've not traditionally been in positions of power and influence suddenly are. So, while an event like the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States was seen by many as a positive thing, as a sign of great progress, that an African American man with a foreign sounding name could ascend to the highest office in the land, it was understood by others as a sign that their place in the world, their very identity, was no longer valid. There's a familiar pattern to this. Nazism in Germany was a movement that took decades to develop, and it was often vigorously opposed. German citizens did not become Nazis overnight, and many never did. But the result of that movement was a society that overtly embraced and supported white supremacy, and the dehumanization and the elimination of Jews and other so-called inferior people, gay people, and really any dissonant voices. It was a paradigm shift from an artistic, intellectual, democratically and socially tolerant culture to one that approved of subjugating other people and entire countries through force, and whose citizens willingly participated in mass murder on an industrial scale. It was a shift to giving up civil liberties and the rule of law in the name of order, patriotism, and the restoration of a national mythology in power, wealth, and destiny. That paradigm shift that happened not all that long ago resulted in the deaths of between 15 and 20 million people. And even when it was defeated, it led to a Cold War that lasted decades, that threatened to destroy all human life with thermonuclear weapons. So paradigms that begin as these small theories and oddball beliefs, they can end up having far-reaching and deadly consequences. How we view reality matters. It matters not only for the health and well-being of a society and our world, but personally, it matters spiritually. I believe humans are spiritually connected, that we're all children of God, and that we're knit together in a mutual, interconnected bond of love. So, I suppose that's my paradigm. My worldview is that we're here for a brief moment in time, for the sole purpose of loving and helping each other. And my own model for that way of looking at things and living comes from a first-century rabbi named Jesus. But I didn't adopt that paradigm in an instant aha moment. It was a shift over time. Because the Jesus I'd grown up hearing about was a figure whose sole purpose, as it related to me, was to die for my sins so that I could go to heaven. Now, I still believe in heaven very much, but no longer as a personal reward for believing the right things or reciting the right formula of words. I don't view my afterlife as an exclusive address reserved for those who just happen to attend the right church, while then everyone else is punished. My gradual paradigm shift occurred as I came to understand my early understanding of Christianity as rather presumptuous and controlling and even selfish. If it's ultimately about saving your own skin when you die, and I realized it flies in the face of how a loving and gracious God would actually behave. And how do we even know how God would behave? Well, we know when we bother to take a look at what Jesus actually said and did, which is consistently positive, hopeful, and healing, and challenging us to free ourselves from any us against them mindset. Challenging us to see the world through the lens of being in justice-filled, loving relationships with each other, to understand that life is not about serving yourself or saving your own hide in the afterlife, but doing all you can to serve and do right by others in this life, because we're all valuable, we're all worth it, we're all loved by God. And when we truly live that way, we are experiencing the kingdom of heaven. Now, I could offer plenty of examples and stories Jesus told about that. But one incident in his life demonstrated how people perceived him, the paradigm through which they understood him and his purpose, how that could shift. Now, we call that the transfiguration. It's what Judy read about this morning. The moment Jesus took his three closest friends to a mountaintop, and what they witnessed changed their perspective completely. Now, like any Bible story, it's really important to look at what happened just before it and right after it. We always need some context. Jesus had been preaching, teaching, and healing, and he had recently somehow fed 4,000 people. It was all amazing and getting plenty of attention, and the disciples, it seems, believed that all this might lead to something really big, namely, to serious political power. Jesus was clearly a force to be reckoned with, a mover and shaker like no one had ever seen before. But Jesus quickly disavows any idea that he's interested in their understanding of power. The power they had in mind was temporary. It involved winners and losers, those on the inside and those left out. So he tells them his power was nothing like that. And a few days later, they climb the mountain where, right before their eyes, Jesus is transformed into a glowing figure, and he's joined for a moment by these two legendary but long-dead heroes from history, Moses and Elijah. Just as soon as it began, the show is over, and they head back down the mountain. What did it all mean? Well, they soon run into a crowd surrounding a young boy who's been possessed by an evil spirit since early childhood. Maybe today we'd say this young lad was psychotic. No one can help the boy, but Jesus does. He lifts him up, and the boy goes about his business, perfectly normal and sane for the first time in his life. The whole arc of that story was a paradigm shift, a new way of seeing the purpose of the power of God's love. Not to be tied to the way we usually define power, and to be connected to the long continuum of God's loving presence in the world through people like Moses and Elijah. And then, what's the ultimate purpose of that presence and power? It's about healing, restoration, new life. Taking a hopeless crisis and restoring hope. Where there was only despair and chaos, giving life and meaning and purpose, saying to a child who everyone thought was a lost cause, you matter, you're valuable, you are loved, no matter what anyone else says, I know better. The power of God's love flows through me to connect with the healing love of God in you. We're well aware that there are people we share this planet with who view the world through a lens of scarcity and bigotry and maintaining the power they believe is their birthright. We can spot them anytime. We hear the language of building walls and classifying people based on their race or religion or ethnicity or sexual orientation. It's a conspiracy-fueled, power-focused, fear-based perspective, and fear is a dangerous thing that can have large-scale consequences. We know that. But far more powerful and enduring is a paradigm shift I am seeing toward an understanding of humanity as bound together in a common destiny, knowing that we need each other and we must trust each other and be there for each other and work with each other, that we must heal those who are hurting, lift up those who have fallen, and give of ourselves to those who need our help. It's a spiritual awakening to view each other as children of a loving God, where everyone is regarded as valuable, as worth it, and as loved. That's a paradigm of heaven on earth, still very much in process, but well worth the effort to make it real. And the good news is, with the power of God's love flowing through us, we are already doing that through this community of loving, committed people. That's our paradigm, our vision, our reality, and our cause.